So why is M103 so controversial, and what difference will it make to Canada's Muslim communities? Well, here to discuss, in North Battleford, Canada, Brad Trost is a Conservative Member of Parliament. Amira Elghawaby is Communications Director at the National Council of Canadian Muslims. She's currently in Brussels. And in Oshawa, Canada, Barbara Perry is Professor at the University of Ontario and Chair of the International Network for Hate Studies. Welcome everyone to the stream. I want to start on my computer with a headline. Take a look at this. House of Commons passes motion to condemn Islamophobia, and underneath it, 201 for, 91 against the motion. Now, Brad, you were among that 91. Why did you vote against it?
I think for me there was a couple fundamental reasons. First of all, it was saying there's a problem in Canada which I don't believe exists. Canadians are tolerant. We care about other Canadians. We believe in religious freedom across the board. Secondly, the whole usage of the word Islamophobia could be construed to say you cannot criticize. You cannot criticize religious or political views related to Islam. And in Canada, we cherish our right to criticize. It doesn't matter if it's Christianity, if it's Judaism, if it's atheism, if it's political of any view or stripe, you're allowed to do it. And that was the fear that it was going to start to block free speech and the interaction that we as Canadians have had for 150 years.
So that point that you raised, it can be construed to say you cannot criticize. You're not the only one who thinks that this is good governance, who just tweeted in, this is a disaster. It will have a chilling effect on free speech. Spineless politicians can't stand up for freedom of expression. Another person tweeting into us, it takes away Canadians' free speech coming to a city near you. Amira, what do you make of that criticism?
Well, you know, I would just ask that question to experts. And so the Canadian Centre, the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression, and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, two of Canada's leading, free speech advocates, have actually come out very strongly to say Motion 103 has nothing to do with shutting down free speech, and in fact support the motion. So I would defer to them to see if this so-called critique of the motion is legitimate, and clearly it is not. It is just an attempt in and of itself to try to silence Canadian Muslim communities that are talking about rising hate crimes, over doubling of hate crimes against Canadian Muslims over the past 3-year period that we have the numbers for, an increase in human rights violations in Canada, and we just had a very tragic situation where there was a terrorist attack on a Quebec City mosque, and 6 men were tragically gunned down while in prayer by an individual who purportedly was sort of consuming anti-Muslim information, Islamophobic information, and following leaders like Marine Le Pen in France, who are campaigning on a xenophobic, Islamophobic platform. So to say that there isn't a problem, I think is simply disappointing, to say the least. And I would ask Mr. Trost to actually talk to Canadian Muslims directly to find out.
Well, let me just say, first of all, I have talked to Canadian Muslims. One of those 91 members of Parliament who voted against the motion is a Canadian Muslim. And let's be blunt here. When you look at the hate crime statistics that are gathered by Stats Canada, the two groups that are still at the top are Jewish Canadians and Canadians of African descent. They still dominate when we have hate crimes discussion. And when you're talking about doubling or tripling over 3 years, that's from effectively nothing to something. Look, a survey done in 2006 asked Canadian Muslims, what is the biggest problem they have in the country? You know what they came up with? The same thing every other Canadian comes up with. The weather. It's cold in Canada, really cold. That's the biggest problem for Canadian Muslims, as it is for all Canadians when you ask them.
So let me say that, if I can.
Go ahead, Barbara, go ahead.
Let me say, if I can, that I too have spoken to a lot of Muslims across Canada. In fact, I conducted one of the first comprehensive sort of pilot studies on Islamophobia in Canada. It was across Ontario and into Quebec. And we ended up with over 400 people participating in that, and every one of them had tales to tell about Islamophobia, whether it was Islamophobic speech or action, women having hijabs ripped off their face, being told to, they didn't have to dress that way, that they should go back to where they came from. That's Islamophobia. It's hostility. It's not criticism. It's hostility directed towards individuals in very harmful, hurtful, and offensive ways. Again, through language, through speech, and through actions as well.
So Barbara, I hear what you're saying there, and yet I want to share something else. This is a recent poll. Canadians think the problem of Islamophobia is overblown. Here's the actual results of that poll. Angus Reid Institute Public Interest Research. The question was, if you were a member of Parliament, how would you vote on this motion in 103? And 42% said they would have voted against the motion. Amira, what do you make of these results?
Well, I mean, I would first of all point to other studies and polls that show different information, right? So I think we have to understand that the arguments that Mr. Trost and members of his party that are still unfortunately trying to bank on fear and stereotype have been making an argument that has really confused the issue. First of all, we have to understand that research has shown that in Canada, 4 in 10 Canadians unfortunately hold negative views of Muslims. And this has unfortunately led to what we've talked about is that hostility, including human rights violations and hate crimes. And by the way, when you talk about hate crimes, any hate crime against any group must be condemned. It's not to say that we are only talking about anti-Muslim hate crimes, that's all that we care about. Obviously, we have stand shoulder to shoulder with Jewish Canadians and members of other groups to condemn all forms of hatred. So I think it's very important to underscore that, and this motion does talk about looking also at systemic racism and other forms of religious discrimination. So I think it's really unfair that members of the Conservative Party are continually trying to sort of trying to muddy the waters of what this issue is. And what we have to also understand is the 2006 survey that Mr. Trost is mentioning from Environics, that actually was updated just last year with a 2016 survey, and actually at the top of issues that are of concern to Canadian Muslims are the treatment by the wider society and discrimination, as well as media representation. So again, update the numbers there and realize that this is an issue. 70,000 people in Canada actually signed an online petition put forward by a member of Parliament named Mr. Frank Bayliss, and that petition actually led to a motion in the fall to condemn Islamophobia that was unanimously supported by the House of Commons and all the parties there. So what's different now is that there is a leadership race on in the Conservative Party, and there are members of the Conservative Party that are pandering to xenophobes who are out there, who are afraid of Muslims, who have probably never ever met
the
point you're making, and Brad, I'm going to give you the space to respond to that, but I just want to share this because someone might agree with Amira, and so I want you to be able to respond to them as well. This is a tweet we got from Willem, who says, I think the Conservative leadership race is the root cause of this. Identity politics gets attention. We also got a video comment from someone who actually pitched the idea for this show. He's a writer and a journalist out of Toronto. This is Stephen Zoe, and here's his take on it.
The real reason that so many Canadians are talking about Motion 103 is because part of the Canadian far right is trying to reinsert itself into national politics and the mainstream of national conversation. And they're doing this by characterizing Motion 103 as a step towards the curbing of free speech in Canada. This has no basis, and this argument has no basis in reality whatsoever.
So Brad, what would you tell Stephen? What would you tell Amira?
That's absolute rubbish. The reason things passed unanimously in the House of Commons is because certain members of Parliament, like myself, were not there. The motion was rejected the previous day when it had been a full House of Commons. Look, 42% of Canadians are not far right. Even a fraction of 1% of Canadians wouldn't qualify as far right in the rest of the world. What this was brought about was the NDP, our Socialist Party, had supported that previous petition, and the Liberals wanted to get political credit by pandering and trying to make this an issue that doesn't exist. Canadians are a tolerant people. Canadians talk about religious freedom. The Conservative Party pushed for and had a specific office for religious freedom. I go into mosques to talk to Muslim Canadians who are my supporters, who work on my campaigns, because they support religious freedom. The whole argument that the Conservatives are fanning this, we didn't introduce the motion, the Liberals did. And again, if you're a Canadian, and most Canadians are immigrants, either first, second, or third generation, you are not a racist. You come from different places. So pinning this on fellow Canadians is absolutely ridiculous. There's not a hint of racism in the broad Canadian society. And
I think that there are people online that would agree with you. Barbara, you look like you want to respond. Go ahead.
I do. I just want to say, let's look at the context in which the motion was first introduced. It was in response to one of the most heinous attacks that we've seen in Canada.
No, it was not. That's factually an error.
Yes, it was in. That was introduced before. Entered, and in the broader context of an uptick in Islamophobic incidents and poster campaigns and graffiti campaigns and vandalism campaigns that began during the Trump campaign and accelerated even after the election. So it is, you've got to look at the broader context. And it was responding to the reality of various forms of discrimination and violence and harassment directed towards our Muslim brothers and sisters.
So I want to clarify the point that Barbara was making. So this was raised and proposed last year. And of course, after this happened, this event, it's seen this tweet here, and you've already heard our guest reference it. Ruba tweets in, the Quebec mosque shooting brought a real and tangible moment to Canada's public sphere, showing Islamophobia as real and fatal. The actual vote on this motion was passed after this Quebec shooting. But the other thing that you mentioned, Barbara, I want to show our audience what that looks like. These are the flyers that we're seeing on some campuses, Canadian campuses, see an alarming rise in right-wing populism. This is an opinion piece in cbc.ca. You can see the poster there. It's time to make Canada great again. This is what another flyer looked like, referencing someone of the Sikh faith, someone with a turban on it. And these were posted around. Barbara, because you've done this research, you're researching the rise of these groups. What is it that you're finding most significant about this? Is this alarming?
Mm-hmm. It is, absolutely. And let me add, too, to that note about CBC. They also had data that indicated a very dramatic increase in hate speech online between November 2015, 2016, and a great deal of that was directed towards Islam and towards Muslims. Yeah, I have studied right-wing extremism in the Canadian context as well, and find that among the favored targets, if I can put it that way, of these extremists are Muslims and Islamic faith. And so you certainly see that, and you certainly see them becoming much more active in our communities, more vocal. They're showing up at town halls, that sort of thing. They're interrupting, they're interrupting free speech and imposing very Islamophobic statements, as well as anti-Semitic and racist. It's not in a vacuum. There are multiple other forms of racism and discrimination, which the motion also, as Amira suggested, is also directed towards. So these groups, I think, are playing an increasing role in mobilizing hatred and mobilizing xenophobia, and particularly mobilizing Islamophobia. We identified by the end of 2015 over 100 such groups in Canada, which will come as a shock to some people, I think. And they were responsible between 85 and 2015 for just what we could count, what we could document, over 120 incidents inspired by their ideology, their far-right ideology of xenophobia. So that's all part of the dynamic that is playing into the current trends.
Brad?
Yeah, I mean, that's the usual political tactic of delegitimizing people's viewpoints by associating with an extremist group. If I had associated Canadian Muslims with Hamas or Hezbollah or ISIS, you'd be rightly outraged. So saying that the 42% of Canadians who would have voted against this, and then affiliating them with extreme groups like what you've mentioned there, I think that's inappropriate. Look, there are some very serious concerns, particularly for Canadians, and many Canadians have immigrated from other parts of the world, and they begin to see this as step one to being a blasphemy law. Does this motion establish that directly? No, but it leads to a study. The study will bring forth recommendations, and from that recommendations can come a bill. Canadians want freedom of speech. Canadians understand that there's persecution, harassment, serious hate crimes all over the world. They look out and they see people around the world. They see Muslim minorities in other parts of the world. They see Christians in other parts of the world. They see Jews in other parts of the world being harassed. They look at Canada. They don't recognize the same thing. They don't recognize what this motion is. This motion is condemning Canada, and Canada is a tolerant country. Canada doesn't want to have rules about what can and cannot be said about different religions.
Brad, you said this could be seen as step one to being a blasphemy law. Amira said she wants to ask you a question. Amira, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, my question, I have many things, of course, to say to Mr. Trost, but I would just say, so are you saying that the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Journalists for Free Expression are leading organizations defending free expression in Canada and around the world? Are they wrong?
Yes, because what they are is political interest groups that have a particular viewpoint. That's fine, they can have it.
So
but do I characterize them as experts? No. Do I characterize them as political participants? Absolutely.
It shouldn't be surprising that you would do that. But okay, so just to get back to, there is a point that I would like to agree with that you mentioned, Mr. Trost, and that is that Canadians, by and large, are tolerant, inclusive people. Absolutely. After the Quebec City tragedy and the terrorist attack on the mosque, we saw thousands of Canadians come out to show their respect, solidarity, and love for Canadian Muslims at vigils right across this country. I mean, I stood out with, fellow Ottawa residents, in freezing cold temperatures around the Eternal Flame on Parliament Hill. We had various cabinet ministers come and join us. We had the Governor General come and join us. It was a moment for all of Canada, and absolutely, the vast majority of Canadians absolutely deplore and abhor hate. The sadness for me now is that our elected officials like yourself, Mr. Trost, and members of the Conservative Party have really let those Canadians down by voting against a motion that is seeking to address the issues that would lead someone to go and kill 6 people. And there was previous motions looking at various specific issues, including a motion on anti-Semitism that was passed in 2015 that you're well aware of, that was endorsed, rightfully so. And there was
Amira, I want to share that with our audience here, because that's something that our online community mentioned as well. This is Mark, who says, the Conservatives passed the same kind of motion regarding anti-Semitism. No one complained. Why complain now? This is what that looked like. This is Erwin Kotler, MP. House unanimously adopts this historic motion condemning the alarming rise of global anti-Semitism. This is in 2015, illustrating your point there. But we actually got a question in for you, Amira. This is a tweet from Barbara, who says, ask Amira if Islamophobia includes criticism of Islam. The definition is at the heart of the matter. And it is one of the criticisms of this bill, is that it didn't say anti-Muslim bigotry, as some people wanted it to say. Islamophobia, some people say it has different meanings. Care to take this on?
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to take that on. So basically, it's very important to understand that no one is suggesting that criticism of Islam is off the table. Anyone can criticize Islam, and the MP Iqra Khalid, who proposed the motion, has been very clear herself that she would be the first to stand up and defend anyone's right to criticize Islam or anything else. Obviously, we all cherish our democratic freedoms, and this is something that Canadian Muslims absolutely share as a value. So it's not right to say that, well, this is going to lead to that. I think that's really what the fear mongers.
Barbara, you're nodding your head there.
Mm-hmm. No,
Barbara's nodding her head. Brad is shaking his. I want to get both of your perspectives in there. Barbara, go ahead first.
And I have said that already, that this is not about Islamophobia. I mean, think of the base, right? The root of that is fear. And so it's not about, again, it's not about criticism. It's about hate speech that denigrates a community or denigrates individuals, as well as the violence that often derives from that, and other forms of discrimination. We're not talking about, halting as a...
It looks like the connection with Barbara might be a little bit shaky, so we're going to make sure that gets fixed. Brad, though, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, don't take my word for it. Erwin Kotler, the Liberal Member of Parliament whose picture you just showed, former human rights expert, he was saying the Islamophobia, that word was a problem in there. So it's not just Conservatives who said that. Objective experts like Mr. Kotler also said that that was the problem. And remember, there was offers for unanimous support if that word would be dropped. So this was a lot of this was about that specific word, which the government refused to take out of the motion.
So Barbara, it looks like we got your connection back, but I actually want to bring in a video comment, and I'll throw this over to you, because this is on that word and whether or not it is problematic, the I word, Islamophobia. This is Walid. He's the co-founder of the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia. Have a listen.
Islamophobia is a term that has been used since the 1900s, and it basically is the irrational fear, dislike, prejudice, or hatred towards those that are Muslim or those that identify to be Muslim or look Muslim, and some of whom are not. My question to those that criticize the term Islamophobia, using freedom of speech as the pretext, how come you're not questioning terms such as racism or anti-Semitism? That is Islamophobic, in my opinion.
Barbara, what did you want to add?
Yeah, well, I also wanted to add, I agree with that definition that was just offered there, but I'd also like to add, I mean, let's look at it in context in terms of the language that's used in the motion. Islamophobia is followed by other forms of systemic racism and religious intolerance. I can't remember, not discrimination, intolerance. So in parallel to other forms of racism and religious bigotry. So the confusion is being created rather than inherent in the way the motion is worded.
I do want to share something that I found alarming. Brad, I'll direct this to you. This is a tweet we got from Ruba, who says the fact that Iqra Khalid, who proposed this motion, has been receiving death and rape threats speaks volumes regarding Islamophobia in Canada. Here's a headline backing that up. Liberal MP swamped with hate mail threats just over the motion. Brad, what do you think attests for that?
Well, I think whoever is behind that, absolutely the police should prosecute and absolutely go to the fullest extent of the law. I'll also remind people, things like this unfortunately do happen. We've had a member of the Conservative Party whose office was firebombed, totally coincidental, odd interest. People get threats to their office and things like that. So the police will, and as they do in Canada, absolutely move to protect. And this is something that should be driven home. The Conservatives and all members of Parliament strongly oppose anyone who makes any threats, any harassment, anything of that. Free speech and harassment and threats are completely different, and trying to equate one with the other is wrong.
So, Amira, this is just a motion to study. What comes next?
Well, I mean, what's going to happen is that there will be a study. We are going to try to understand the phenomenon of Islamophobia, which again is a term that is widely understood to mean the irrational fear and hatred of Muslims leading to discrimination. And so there will be a study of that now in Canada. And Canada right now actually has an opportunity to be a leading example for the world, and particularly the Western world, in how to ensure that various minority communities are indeed having full protection of their charter rights or whatever human rights that they have protected as any other citizen in the country. And so this is an opportunity for Canada where we are seeing, unfortunately, growing populism, where we are seeing xenophobic campaigns and politicians sort of trying to feed into, again, Islamophobic tendencies that are out there due to various issues in the world, including, of course, violent extremism. We have to say that, you know, Canadian Muslims have stood very strongly to condemn violent extremism and violent extremists wherever they are. And part of the issue that we have to understand here is among the narratives of the violent extremists is to say that, you know what, to the Muslim minorities in the Western world, you will never be able to fully be accepted in those societies. You are going to face hatred and discrimination. And what we are saying is absolutely not. You know, Canada is a place where Canadian Muslims are contributing very positively in all sectors, are doing so much good in various places. And it's so important for us to understand that when we're talking about dealing with elements in society that are racist,
we're going to have to leave the conversation right there. It's a perfect way to pause it. We got the gist of what you were saying. Our thanks to Amira, Elghawaby, Brad Trost, and Barbara Perry, and of course, Star Community for pitching this show. Conversation continues online with #AJStream.